Subcommittee's meeting today to hear testimony on DDT dumping off the Southern California coast, its ecological impacts, scientific needs, and next steps. Under Committee Rule 4F, any oral opening statements at the hearing are limited to the chairman and the ranking member or their designees. This allows us to hear from our witnesses sooner and helps members keep their schedules. Therefore, I ask unanimous consent that all members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record if they're submitted to the clerk by 5 p.m. today or the close of the hearing, whichever comes first. Hearing no objection, it is so ordered. Without objection, the chair may also declare a recess subject to the call of the chair. As described in the notice, statements, documents, or motions should be submitted to the electronic repository. The email address for that is hnrcdocs@mail.house.gov. Additionally, please note, as with our in-person meetings, members are responsible for their own microphone. And so members will only be muted by staff if it's necessary to avoid inadvertent background noise. Finally, members or witnesses experiencing technical problems should inform committee staff right away so we can try to get that resolved. I will begin this hearing by recognizing myself for an opening statement. And thank you again for joining us today. Today's hearing focuses on a topic that many of us, especially those from California, have been reading about in the newspaper in recent months. It's a problem that appears to extend beyond Southern California. And given the potential magnitude of it, even though we currently have more questions than answers, there is some urgency to finding out as much as we can, and that's why we wanted to call this hearing. So as you'll learn and hear about more today, scientists recently discovered that thousands of barrels of DDT and other waste were dumped decades ago off the coast of Southern California. The truth is, we don't yet know the full extent of this dumping or what all of the impacts are to marine life, ecosystems, or even to human health. Since the LA Times first reported these findings in October of last year, Congressman Alan Lowenthal has been a clear leader in this space, and it's time now, I think, for Congress to give this problem the scrutiny it deserves. Today is World Oceans Day, which provides an important reminder of how much the ocean provides for us and also why we need to keep it healthy. From the oxygen we breathe to the fish that feed over 1 billion people, ocean resources are critical to lives and livelihoods all over the world. So it's appropriate that today we bring attention to the ocean dumping and pollution that has plagued our ocean for decades, but has for too long been swept under the rug. As hard as it is to fathom today, from 1930 to into the 1970s, it was common to dump waste and toxins such as the pesticides DDT and others, PCBs, a host of other harmful chemicals, just straight into the ocean. In California, toxic chemicals were dumped into sewers and into storm drains that discharged straight into the Pacific, wreaking havoc on the ecosystem. And now it's been brought to light that for decades, barges were loaded and taken offshore into federal waters where they dumped innumerable barrels of DDT sludge and other wastes with unknown contents thousands of feet down to the seafloor. The Ocean Dumping Act of 1972 finally banned this actively destructive disposal practice, but of course these chemicals didn't just disappear with the passage of that law. Nearly a half century has passed since that act, and it is time to meaningfully address the full extent and the long-term effects of these past environmental practices. Thanks to some extraordinary advancements in technology and great journalism, the effective partnerships between public and private institutions also, a science-driven assessment of this damage has begun. And there was a recent research cruise funded by NOAA, Scripps, and UC Santa Barbara, go Gauchos. And the scientists on this trip led an expedition to survey one of the potential deep sea barrel graveyards. And what they found was more horrifying than even the experts could have imagined. The area they set out to explore uncovered so many pieces of debris that no human could effectively count them all. The researchers developed algorithms to help, but even artificial intelligence underestimated the total. And in the end, researchers did not find any boundaries for this debris in any direction of their survey. They conservatively estimate that a staggering 100,000 pieces of debris, including at least 27,000 barrel-shaped objects, pollute the seafloor at just one of 14 designated dumping areas in Southern California alone. Now, this type of evidence demonstrates that we are only at the beginning of understanding the severity of this situation. We do know that marine mammals in Southern California, like dolphins, have been found with DDT compounds in their blubber. Local sea lions are developing aggressive cancer as a direct result of this poisoning. And these examples provide a warning of what more research could uncover. DDT manufacturers were not the only culprit. And the ocean off Southern California is not their only victim. From coast to coast, the oil and gas industry has also dumped harmful byproducts from their refining processes into the ocean. And in the Gulf of Mexico, similar dumping circumstances have recently made headlines. Unfortunately, there will likely be more to follow. So we must scale up efforts to map and identify areas where ocean dumping has occurred, and we must address them with thoughtful mitigation measures to limit any further harm. If you think about it, more and more people want to use our oceans, whether that's for renewable energy development, laying telecommunication cables, fishing, or developing aquaculture facilities. There's a lot. And we need to know what is on the seafloor so we can understand the risk and make good decisions. So today our committee will engage with scientists and policymakers, and we'll likely have more questions than answers. We know a lot of research and mapping still needs to be done, but it's important that we start the process. It will be a long process, but it's an essential first step on this World's Ocean Day. So with that, I now recognize Ranking Member Benz for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you. While I have a moment to talk about the hearing we had several weeks ago on the drought, and I just want to say thank you for having that hearing. And Mr. Chair, also I want to mention that this situation, as I read about it in anticipation of this hearing, reminded me all too much of the situation we have up at Hanford, up in Washington State, and the incredible challenges we face in that cleanup activity. Well, of course, DDT has a long history in this region. First, massive quantities of the chemical were produced over a 45-year period, and the legacy of DDT still lives with this Superfund cleanup site and other contaminated areas off California's shore, and I'm sure other shores. Currently, there are 14 known industrial dump sites off Los Angeles County coast, not all of which contain DDT, but with the recent discovery of approximately 27,000 barrels located over 3,000 feet beneath the ocean surface, there are understandable concerns about the impacts of that site and the cumulative contamination of remaining sites. I understand we have 4 witnesses here today who will discuss these concerns. Some of them, I'm sure, will note that there are many unanswered questions about the recent discovery, particularly regarding what's in the barrels and associating and assessing the risks to humans, marine mammals, fish, and overall environment while not harming tourism. The Federal Environmental Protection Agency and National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration recently held a briefing with my staff on these barrels. The EPA in particular laid out a 4-tiered action plan that will help determine next steps. And NOAA indicated that it may need more funding to help finance another deep sea exploratory expedition at the site. Those agencies clearly have a scientific and financial role to play here, but unfortunately they're not going to be participating in today's hearing. If they're going to be part of the solution, I'm sure they are. It does seem to we'll have to hear from them also. And with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back the remainder of my time.
Well, I thank the ranking member, and I agree. I think we do need to include those agencies in future conversations. And I thank you for your comment about the drought hearing, which I agree was really productive. So appreciate that. Our first witness is going to be Secretary Jared Blumenfeld of the California Environmental Protection Agency. And Representative Alan Lowenthal would like to introduce our next witness, Mr. Michael Palmer. So with that, I will yield to Mr. Lowenthal for that introduction.
Well, thank you, Chairman Huffman. It's my great pleasure to introduce Mr. Michael Palmer. Michael is the Assistant City Manager for the City of Avalon with a little under 4,000 permanent residents. The City of Avalon is the largest city on the island of Catalina. honored to represent the island of Catalina in the Congress of the United States. And Michael has served as the Assistant City Manager since 2019, where he's done a great job trying to protect this community, heavily dependent upon tourism, from the unique challenges of the drought. And if it was just the drought, it would still be a crisis on the island. But it's more than the drought. We're talking about a pandemic that has halted all tourism, all travel, basically, to the island in over a year. And so I look forward to continuing to work with Michael, the city of Avalon, and the rest of the communities on Catalina as we work to responsibly reopen the economy, get travelers back on the islands, and mitigate the community from the impacts of the shameful legacy of this industrial pollution off our shore. Michael, welcome to the committee. Thank you for joining us today. I do want to say, I don't know if you've heard that in the transportation infrastructure, we were able to get a sizable amount of money for the construction of the mold, which is critically important for the city of Avalon. So with that, welcome to our committee.
Yeah, thank you. So we'll hear from Mr. Palmer in just a moment, but let me just read off the rest of the panelists that we're going to be hearing from. After Mr. Palmer, we'll hear from Dr. Una Ho. Una Ha, I believe is the proper pronunciation. And he's a professor and division head of environmental health at the University of, hang on a second, at San Diego State University. Okay, and then our last witness will be Dr. Lehine Aluwihare, and I apologize if I'm getting some of these pronunciations wrong. But Dr. Aluwihare is professor and chemical oceanographer at Scripps Institution of Oceanography. So let me just remind all of the witnesses that under committee rules, they should limit their oral statements to 5 minutes, but the entire written statement that they have will be in the hearing record. And when you begin, the timer will show on the WebEx platform there. It'll turn orange when you have 1 minute left. And I recommend the members and witnesses lock the timer on their screen so that they can track it as they go. After your testimony is complete, please remember to mute yourself to avoid any background noise. And I will also allow the entire panel to finish testimony before we bring it back to the members for questions. So the chair now recognizes Secretary Jared Blumenfeld. Welcome, Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'd like to also thank the committee for giving me this opportunity to be here today to testify on this critical issue. For the record, my name is Jared Blumenfeld, and I'm the Secretary of California's Environmental Protection Agency. And in this role, I oversee the state's efforts to fight climate change, protect air and water quality, regulate pesticides and toxic substances, and achieve the state's recycling waste reduction goals while advancing environmental justice. From 2009 to 2016, I served under former President Barack Obama as the regional administrator for the United States Environmental Protection Agency for the Pacific Southwest, a region that includes California, Nevada, Arizona, Hawaii, the Pacific Islands, and 148 tribal nations. And today, as a member of Governor Gavin Newsom's cabinet, it's my job to advise the governor on environmental policy. The state of California is extremely concerned about the legacy of deepwater ocean disposal of chemical, refinery, and other waste, including the disposal by Montrose Corporation of acid waste containing DDT at deepwater dump sites in the San Pedro Channel. Since recent media reports and deepwater surveys have been conducted, my agencies and our state colleagues from the Natural Resources Agency, in close collaboration with the United States Environmental Protection Agency and the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, as well as other federal partners, have worked to discuss what we can do and what we know, and probably more importantly, what we currently don't know about the scope and scale of any ongoing public health and environmental impacts of this historical practice of deepwater ocean dumping. Just to give a brief historical background, there are 14 documented deepwater ocean disposal sites off the coast of Southern California that received these chemical, refinery, and other wastes between 1930s and the 1960s. We know based on the historical record that Montrose routinely, as a matter of its normal business practices, arranged for the disposal of acid waste containing DDT at several of these ocean disposal sites from the 40s until the early 1960s. US EPA has shared the results of this research of the Montrose operation, and historically it indicates that the acid waste containing DDT was actually disposed in bulk, not generally in barrels. Prior state and federal investigations of these historical dumping practices predominantly focus on the discharge of DDT waste in nearshore waters off the Los Angeles Harbor and Palos Verdes shelf through storm drains in the sewer system and its impact on marine life and human health. The Montrose site, as was noted by the ranking member, including the Palos Verdes shelf, was placed on USA's Superfund list in 1989. Recent C4 survey and dump site examinations, as you'll hear more from other expert witnesses today, show us that based on this scientific research, the state believes that the historic waste disposal at these deep ocean sites need to be assessed comprehensively to evaluate their full scope and impact. Given that California's legal jurisdiction extends 3 nautical miles from the coastline, it's understanding that most, if not all, of the recently discussed DDT barrels fall within federal waters and are subject to federal jurisdiction. Nevertheless, this situation requires close interagency collaboration. California will continue to coordinate regularly with our federal partners as they identify next steps to further understand this concerning issue. We've made a good start on this front, as multi-agency cooperation, the Water Board, the California Department of Toxic Substances Control, both part of Cal EPA, as well as the Natural Resources Agency, US EPA, and NOAA. Members of the California State Legislature have also voiced their support that Congress and US EPA take all measures to prevent further damage by DDT waste dumped in the San Pedro Channel by introducing Assembly Joint Resolution for consideration during this legislative session. We'll all focus on what to do about this environmental travesty, and the first and very most important step is to quickly gather data and information to answer some key questions. The initial focus has been on dump site number 2, which is the subject of the March 2021 survey by Scripps Institution of Oceanography in cooperation with NOAA, which you'll hear about from Scripps in a minute. The new information collected in late March by Scripps has been invaluable, but significant research is required. We need to first document the operational and regulatory history of dump site number 2. This will entail determining the types and volumes of waste disposed. We also need to, secondly, determine the extent of drum disposal and the nature of contamination by identifying the boundaries of dump site number 2 and the types of waste remaining in sediment on the ocean floor. We will then be able to, thirdly, evaluate the entire Southern California bight through establishing historical baseline concentrations and conducting trend analysis for contaminants of concern in sediment, water, and biota. And finally, we'll need to assess the ongoing impacts and risk to ocean life, including impacts up the food chain to marine mammals, as well as seafood contamination that may pose a risk to consumers. Once these questions are answered, we can begin weighing possible actions that could redress this legacy of environmental pollution and mitigate potential impacts. US EPA has removal authority to access funds through this authority to evaluate the environmental impacts of the barrels. As a result, any funding, development, plans and remediation or removal will be the primary responsibility of the federal government.
Thank you, Secretary Blumenfeld. We're going to have to leave it there, but I'll give you a chance to expand on those opening comments here in a moment. Next, the chair recognizes Mr. Palmer to testify for 5 minutes. Welcome, Mr. Palmer.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much, Congressman Lowenthal, for the wonderful introduction and your unwavering commitment to the community of Avalon and Catalina Island. Chairman Huffman, Ranking Member Bentz, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today regarding the DDT dumping off of the Southern California coast at disposal site number 2. On behalf of the city of Avalon, I would like to express our strong support for all necessary measures to prevent further damage as a result of the DDT and other toxic chemical waste dump site, the protection and preservation of our vulnerable natural resources, and the protection of the public's health and safety. Avalon is an island coastal community in the westernmost portion of LA County, located on Santa Catalina Island, approximately 26 miles from the mainland of Southern California. The city is 2.8 square miles in size and home to approximately 4,000 people year-round, with over 1 million visitors annually. Avalon is the only incorporated municipality on the island, of which 76 miles is protected natural conservation land, with over 62 miles of publicly accessible, undeveloped coastline, 9 federally designated marine protection areas, and 4 areas of special biological significance, the island is home to more than 60 endemic plant, animal, and insect species found nowhere else in the world, and many protected species of marine life. The city and Catalina Island have a vibrant tourist and recreation-based economy that plays a major role in Southern California's $160 million ocean tourist economy. The daily city population can increase between 200 to 500% in the peak summer season, typically June through September. Avalon's economy and the welfare of its residents is dependent on tourism and robust policies of environmental stewardship that protects its natural resources and the public health and safety of its residents. Avalon and the island also have a strong environmental protection philosophy, an inherent mission of protecting coastal resources, and unique state and federal safeguards that protect the environment from pollution and preserve water quality. As an island physically isolated from the California mainland by the Pacific Ocean, water quality and ocean conservation is critical to the physical and economic well-being of our community. However, the rediscovery of DDT and other toxic chemical waste dumping at disposal site number 2 and across the 14 dump sites off the California coast in the San Pedro Basin poses a significant threat to the island's marine life, our residents' and visitors' health, and our future economic viability. While the full ecological and health impacts from the DDT and other chemical waste dumping are still being assessed decades later, critical federal and state support is needed to clean up this site. The significance of the amount of DDT dumped in the basin and other toxic waste can't be overstated. While not as visible as the 17-mile Superfund site off the Palos Verdes shelf that was designated in 1996 that addressed DDT and PCBs were released from where sewage emptied directly into the ocean, the scale and scope of DDT and other toxic chemical waste dumping further out into the San Pedro Basin amounts to gross criminal negligence at best and potentially one of the most abhorrent environmental tragedies at worst. Significant funding and resources are desperately needed. Avalon, as with many other communities across the nation, continues to grapple with the devastating human and economic impacts of COVID-19 that has left in its wake. As our community begins to rebuild its fragile economy, the looming DDT issue threatens to have a perverse impact on our economy, as many potential visitors feel unsure and unsafe about visiting the island and its surrounding waters. Without visitors returning to Avalon, the city's economic recovery will be severely prolonged, leaving the city vulnerable to endogenous and exogenous shocks and further eroding quality of life. Recent efforts from the Montrose Settlements Restoration Program have provided much needed education and has also restored habitats and wildlife in areas close to the Palos Verdes Shelf Superfund site. However, no funding has been allocated to addressing the San Pedro dump site. Further complicating the issue, the Catalina Island Conservancy, as the privately owned, publicly accessible conservation, is ineligible for state and federal assistance, despite protecting approximately 88% of the island. The City of Avalon values the opportunity to work with the committee and applauds the committee for taking action to address the issue. Thank you and your staff for all the work and support necessary to prevent further damage, protect our vulnerable natural resources, and protect the public's health and safety.
Rep. Lowenthal, if you're de facto chair here, you're on mute.
Oh, unmuted. Thank you. Thank you, Representative Case. Are we willing? We don't have in front of me the actual script. Who's our next? Is it Dr. Alawihara? Our next witness?
I think Dr. Ho is next, actually.
Dr. Hara is our next witness?
Yes.
Hi, I'd like to welcome Dr. Hara for 5 minutes of testimony. Welcome to the committee, Dr. Hara.
Okay, good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to speak before you today. I'm a professor of environmental health in the School of Public Health in San Diego State University. My research is focused on the fate of organic contaminants in environments and human and wildlife contaminant exposure assessment. Since I joined San Diego State University in 2009, ocean and human health in Southern California has been one of my primary research interests. One of the consistent findings across multiple projects was DDT and DDT-related chemicals were the most abundant environmental contaminants in marine mammals in Southern California, although DDT was banned 50 years ago. DDT is extremely persistent and bioaccumulative. DDT biomagnifies through food chains, resulting in high contaminants accumulation at the top of the food web. The top predators, such as marine mammals, have the highest wildlife concentrations, making them vulnerable to toxic contaminants, and also making them as a sentinels for ocean and human health. Our recent measurements of DDT accumulation in Southern California marine mammals indicated extremely high pollution of DDT in the region. For example, that we analyzed the DDT in mature common bottlenose dolphins from the region. The DDT concentration of the dolphins was the highest among regions of the US and globally. In addition, we identified 45 DDT-related compounds for the first time in the bottlenose dolphin blubber. This includes major DDT chemicals, but also DDT degradation, the DDT technical mixture impurities, etc. Among them, trischlorophenylmethane, it's called a TCPM, and its metabolite, the TCPM-OH, were identified for the first time in Southern California marine mammals and confirmed that they were present as impurity in technical grade DDT at very low concentrations. In our several following studies, we consistently observed similar results in other marine mammal species in the region. DDT was most abundant among the contaminants groups, and then TCPM was the next among abundant contaminants. In addition, we found DDT and TCPM showed endocrine disruption and significant cellular impacts in Southern California dolphins. Other research groups reported also recent environmental impacts of DDT along the California coast. Dr. Goland and her team found that persistent contaminants, including DDT and herpesvirus, were positively associated with the cancer in wild California sea lions. Other groups also reported that California condors, which are as an endangered species, reintroduced to the California coast, had a large body burden of DDT, almost 20 times more than non-coastal condors. This makes sense because coastal condors' primary diet source is dead, stranded marine mammals. Reproductive problems such as eggshell thinning, depressed hatching success, endocrine disruption observed in coastal California condors, which was associated with an increased DDT body burden. In 2011-2013, as previous witnesses explained, Dr. Valentine's discovery of discarded waste containers below 3,000 feet of ocean water near the Catalina Island changed the long-standing assumption that Palos Verdes shelf is the source of DDT pollution in the region. The dump site sediment was contaminated with DDT at levels 40 times greater than on the nearby Palos Verdes shelf. In addition, TCPM and its metabolite TCPM-OH were also present in the dump site sediment, additionally suggesting DDT dump site as a source of DDT pollution in the marine mammals. A very recent survey by the Scripps Institution of Oceanography with NOAA found 27,000 dumped barrels in the area. Likewise, the long-term assumption that the Palos Verdes shelf is the primary source of DDT pollution in the region is probably incorrect. The DDT in the deep ocean barrel dumping sites with relatively low oxygen and sunlight is likely more persistent than other shallower Palos Verdes shelf. DDT pollution has been considered, passed, or done. However, with the discovery of the DDT waste barrel dumpings in extremely high concentrations of DDT in the wildlife in the region, it is rather new and unresolved, threatening ocean and human health in the region. It is critically important to reassess the DDT pollution in the Southern California marine environments more broadly along the western coast of the US, since potentially impacted wildlife can have large habitats.
Thank you, Dr. Huff. And I will give you a chance to expand on some of that also in a moment. And I apologize to everyone. My network decided to crash and took me a few minutes to get back with you. But I will now recognize Dr. Alawihare as our next witness for 5 minutes. Welcome, Doctor.
Good afternoon, Chairman Huffman, Ranking Member Bentz, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to speak at this hearing. I'm Lahini Alawihare, a professor of chemical oceanography at UC San Diego's Scripps Institution of Oceanography. I'd like to start by thanking members of this subcommittee for their ongoing commitment to ensuring a sustainable relationship with the ocean and its ecosystems, and for recognizing the important role the ocean plays in providing for and protecting human populations. Scripps Institution of Oceanography has played a role in the rediscovery of the deep ocean dump site for industrial and chemical waste in San Pedro Basin. This site sits approximately 3,000 feet below the surface of the ocean, 10 miles off Los Angeles' Palos Verdes Peninsula, and DDT has indeed been detected in its sediments. This is one of two major ocean sites in the California borderland ocean basins as described in Alan Chartrand's 1985 report. At these sites, permitted industrial waste dumping was recorded between the 1930s and as late as 1960s. In April 2021, Scripps scientist Eric Terrell led a team that surveyed 36,000 acres at this dump site with advanced sonar methods deployed on underwater robots. Sophia Merrifield, also from Scripps, applying machine learning techniques, mapped approximately 27,000 barrel-like targets, several of which extended beyond the assigned location of the dump site. This work significantly increased the detected industrial debris and the aerial extent of the dumping, but the limits of the debris field were not reached. With input from many of my colleagues, I propose how Scripps can contribute to next steps that address outstanding concerns, such as what risk does this dump site pose to humans? What risk does it pose to ocean ecosystems? Can future ocean activities increase these risks? And what should be done to minimize the risks? Unfortunately, with the information currently available, we cannot answer these questions definitively. In order to do so, we need a thorough scientific characterization of the dump site. The US government's ongoing investment in basic science, coastal monitoring efforts, and technology development now provide us with the contextual scientific knowledge and technology to comprehensively and efficiently take on this task. Through a coordinated effort between stakeholders, scientists, policymakers, and state and federal funding agencies, we must obtain a more accurate sense of the scale of containerized and non-containerized waste dumping, including a chemical inventory of the disposed waste at this site. Additionally, it is necessary to map the extent to which contamination has escaped containment and assess the potential of these barrels to lose integrity in the future. We further hope to investigate the coupled physical and biological processes that transport and alter the fate of the waste. A focus of our early efforts will be to understand how marine organisms have and are interacting with and mobilizing the waste. Are animal communities ingesting this waste? Have they compromised containment? And has the community been altered by contaminants? And are the processes at the seafloor helping to mobilize and transfer DDT and other contaminants to organisms in the upper ocean? And are these processes just simply burying the waste? Importantly, distinguishing contaminants originating from the deep dump site versus the coastal site is also a priority, so that contaminants bioaccumulating and biomagnifying through Southern California food webs can be attributed to the correct source. In this way, we can ascertain whether the deep dump site poses a risk to ecosystems and subsequently to humans through the ingestion of contaminated seafood. A synthesis of the scientific findings from each of these lines of investigation is necessary to inform policymakers and stakeholders tasked with determining how this site will be managed in the future. To be clear, while this dump site is off the California coast, it has global implications. For example, we know that migrating top predators feeding off Southern California's coasts carry a uniquely high load of DDT. It might be expected that similar dump sites exist throughout U.S. coastal waters, while deep water environmental hazards can also result from other activities. Therefore, the technology that will be developed through the proposed comprehensive effort in the San Pedro Basin will provide a framework that is transferable to other sites. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Alawihari. We'll now turn to questions from the members. I'll begin by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. And Secretary Blumenfeld, I'd like to begin with you. First of all, we cut off, I think, the tail end of your opening statement. So if you wanted to expand on some of the next steps that you were describing, I'll allow you to do that. What I really wanted to ask you, though, is since you have worked on both the state and federal side of this, what are the types of information that you think state and federal agencies are going to need as we figure out next steps going forward? And do you have any preliminary thoughts on who should be held accountable and what would be needed in order to pursue such accountability at this stage?
Well, first of all, again, thank you, Chair Huffman and members. As you heard from the expert testimony, I mean, this is an incredibly complex place in which to investigate anything. 3,000 feet below the ocean surface is a very tough environment to ascertain many of the things that we heard just from Scripps, the exact nature, the extent and of the contamination, the historical baselines, and the ongoing risk. All those elements, which are really key to being able to take the next step, are not easy in this ocean environment. So by way of context, the Superfund site at the Palos Verdes Shelf, which I'd spent time with our Superfund staff when I was at US EPA, that which is near shore, has been studied greatly, is itself very difficult to analyze. So that is in part why this has been such a challenge and why the breakthroughs in technology that we heard from NOAA and Scripps really kind of are a game changer in being able to ascertain this. So really it's documenting the operational and regulatory history. It's determining the extent of the drum disposal and the nature of the contamination. It's then understanding kind of the context within the Southern California bight, and then it's assessing the ongoing impacts and risk to ocean life. So those are the four, I think, areas of examination that we need to look at. And this obviously takes funding, significant funding and attention. And this hearing that you're having today, I think, is a really critical beginning to that process of bringing public education and realizing, to your point, Chair Huffman, that the legacy that we have with DDT didn't end with the Ocean Dumping Act. The legacy of DDT, whether it's the mining or the factory in LA, or the historic issues, are really difficult to deal with because of the nature of these chemicals, that they bioaccumulate. They're forever chemicals, in the same way that we're dealing with PFAS and PFOA and other chemicals today. So I think the work that we're all ongoing looking at is going to take time. It is going to take funding. But I think you have all the right players in place to be able to achieve those goals.
All right, thank you. Let me turn to Dr. Huff. And as I understand it, Doctor, your research team discovered new contaminants linked to DDT that most conventional environmental analyses wouldn't have even detected. So how worried should we be about routine environmental analysis missing these kind of compounds? And what does your research say about the degree of risk to the environment and potentially even to human health?
Yes, the chemicals that we discovered, it's called the TCPM, but it's not a one compound either. It's the multiple isomers, multiple chemicals, and also its related compound, the TCPMOH. We used the called a non-targeted analytical method, which is pretty new and novel way of an environmental monitoring methods, because that's pretty much more like, we call it like, with all this technology advancement, we have a better measurement, better detection techniques. And then the typical environmental monitoring is basically looking at that only a few known contaminants. So that way, even though other chemicals are very abundant in environment, they are missed. So that's what happened for the past several decades. One of the very interesting part is that, the dump site near the sediments contained the same chemicals as well, which could be a clue, could be an indicator, but it tells us that it's very important to conduct comprehensive environmental monitoring for the wide range of chemicals. So that way we can understand that what's the source, what's the behaviors of chemicals, what are the fates of the chemicals, that we can maybe differentiate that the sources, whether those are coming from the deep ocean, whether coming from the coastal, more shallow segments area. In terms of toxicology, in terms of the biological activities of these new chemicals, we don't really know much about it.
Okay. Thank you very much, Doctor. I will now recognize Ranking Member Benz for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to the witnesses. It's extraordinarily interesting set of issues. So I'm just going to start it. I'm not quite sure who to ask these questions of. I will start with Mr. Blumenfeld, but I may have the wrong witness, but I'll start with him, and I'll just ask if there's any indication of the cost of a cleanup of the type we're contemplating here. And I understand we may not know the full scope of the problem, but can you give us some idea of what we're looking at when it comes to cost as we talk about this challenge?
Thank you, Ranking Member Benz. Yeah, to your initial opening statement about the need to bring in US EPA and NOAA, I would concur. From my experience, the next phase of exploration, really within the next year or two, working with Scripps and other institutions, would be in the $10 to $20 million range, and that's really just for the next level of investigation. But again, I think those numbers would need to be confirmed by folks closer to the ground in terms of cleanup experience. But that's, I think, the range of what we would need, which would obviously pale in comparison to the potential actual cleanup costs.
And follow up to that, I was involved peripherally in the Superfund site up in Portland in the Willamette River, where the site was covered up with 3 feet of clay. The concept being to try to hold it in place and to keep it from migrating anywhere while we tried to sort out what to do about it. Far more shallow environment. The water's not that deep there as compared to 3,000 feet. Do you, as you look at the situation and not knowing as much as we need to know, do you have a date where you think something really could begin to happen with the rupture of those drums, or is it just anybody's guess?
That would probably be better answered by Professor from Scripps. All I'd say is there's kind of institutional controls and caps would need to be, because of the huge expense of doing anything 3,000 feet under the water, would need Congressman to be based on ascertaining maybe there's no material left in the drums. Maybe the material in the drums doesn't have constituents that we would be concerned about. So we can do a lot by records analysis to determine where the most, at the moment we're looking at site number 2. Further investigation may lead us to look at other sites. So I think that the first and most important work is characterization, determining where the problem is, and then looking at what kind of controls need to be put in place. But we're slightly before the stage of being able to work out what kind of remedial action needs to be taken.
And indeed, thank you for that. And rather than try to embarrass myself by mispronouncing the professor from Scripps' name, this question is to the professor from Scripps. And the question is this: I have a nephew who is engaged in cleanups around the Pacific Rim with a company out of Hawaii. And he goes from place to place, catches fish. The fish are tested. They then determine what's in the water, and they then decide what they're going to do. My question to you is this: should we anticipate there are many other sites just like this scattered around the world that we should be worried about?
Dr. Alawahari, are you with us? She may have stepped away. Congressman Bentz, did any of the other witnesses want to endeavor an answer to that? Or I don't mean to redirect your question, Cliff, but I don't see her.
Happy to have anybody else have somebody else take a shot at it. That would be great.
Well, I'd say, Congressman Chair Blumenfeld from California. Yes, I mean, for instance, the Farallon Islands in Congressman Huffman's district, there's history of dumping of radiological material. I mean, throughout the 1960s, there was unfortunate historic pattern of dumping at sea, which eventually led to a UN convention to prevent such dumping. But yeah, there was a long historical precedent of this, and this is certainly not isolated, unfortunately, to this one area.
I see Dr. Alawahari.
Thank you so much. And with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Let's add some more time to the clock and allow Dr. Alawahari to answer your very good question here, if you would, Doctor.
I apologize for that. I don't know what happened to I could hear all of you. So that question about, I'm responding to the question about whether we should expect this sort of thing to be present worldwide. I don't have the perspective to answer that, but certainly based on what we've seen, at least in the US, there are certainly other sites where such dumping took place, and it's hard to believe that it wouldn't have happened at other locations. And I think Jared Blumenfeld pointed out that really today now we have the kind of technology that's really required to start addressing this question. And I think what we would really like to do at Scripps is to provide sort of a roadmap for how you can, do these kinds of investigations in other locations as well. So thank you, and I apologize for that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
All right. Thank you. The chair now recognizes Congresswoman Grace Napolitano, who has been around Southern California long enough to remember some of these issues from her local work. So welcome, Congresswoman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Secretary Blumenfeld, for nearly 2 decades removed from the settlement at Superfund site off the immediate coast of Southern California, and significant resources were applied then to study and remediate the area in cooperation with private sector, both state and federal agencies. Can you comment on the effectiveness of those partnerships, what worked, what hasn't, and expand on lessons learned that might apply to offshore site? At the same time, what would it take to put together a think tank of being able to assess what needs to be done and then come to Congress for funding?
First of all, Congresswoman Napolitano, just thank you for your personal leadership on these water, wastewater, drinking water issues. Really, the country owes you a huge debt of gratitude. So thank you for everything that you've done. As it relates to the Superfund site, I think, the number one thing that when people ask us and constituents of yours ask you the question kind of, should we be concerned about the risk from DDT? Certainly those near water issues with the Palos Verdes shelf, the number one thing that we learned was to set up controls to make sure that people understood the risks of eating fish. That's the main exposure pathway. The exposure pathways, people don't need to be worried about playing in the water on the beaches of California or in Catalina Island. That isn't an exposure pathway that people need to be concerned about. But really, what we do need to make sure is that the food web and people and animals exposure to that DDT through food is the main pathway. So we spent a huge amount of time understanding the issues on the Palos Verdes shelf. There's all kinds of mysteries, like how the DDT migrated off the shelf, where it went. In these undersea environments, it's extremely complex, but we have 15 plus years of incredibly good data from which to build upon. And Congresswoman, that helps us do a number of things. It gives us a real good baseline of what was there, to understand what is background versus what has been added to from these barrels. We can understand kind of the very complex ocean movements of DDT. So unfortunately, because of this history of DDT in your district and in Southern California, we know a lot more than we would otherwise. But again, understanding that it's 10 miles off and 3,000 feet under the water, there's a lot still to do. So I think what you will be able to get from especially United States Environmental Protection Agency and the leadership there in Region 9 is a sense of what are the next steps with Scripps, with NOAA, that they would plan out a 2-year catalog of activities that we would be happy to support, but I think they need to take the lead in providing you such a budget.
What would you think of the cost would be to begin the process?
As I mentioned to the ranking member, I would say from the early discussions that we have is to really concretize some of the work that Professor Al-Wahari mentioned, and she may be able to talk about the Scripps budget component, but within the next year, it feels like a $10 to $20 million research budget to be able to answer the questions about what's been sent out there, what's the state of it. Yeah.
Just the research.
Yes.
Dr. Ho, decades after uncontrolled and even permitted dumping of harmful pollutants, the true extent of this coming to light at the long-term implications for ocean dumping may have on public health, and whether the numerous known and unknown legacy dump sites throughout the U.S. territorial waters pose risk to people and communities that live near the shore or dependent on marine life for subsistence or livelihood. I understand that this is not as much of a problem for the beaches, but what about people who live and fish and recreate in those areas?
Yes, Congressman. As previous witness mentioned, that the exposure to DDT and the chemical contaminants with the similar properties like a DDT, as long as it's not, those chemicals are currently, have been banned for many decades. So they're not currently used. However, they are existent in the environments, and then the food web is the problem. So the chemicals are very persistent. They do not really easily degrade, and then they transport through the food web. So it's mostly the exposure is through the food, the fish, the marine, the seafood consumption is the major route to exposure. So that is very well investigated, and there's lots of fish advisories. So definitely, the advisory, the how much food and you have to take, and also it's also different from the stages, like from children or the pregnant women and the breastfeeding women. They're all different. There are definitely we needed to investigate or identify the vulnerable populations. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Ha. And the gentlelady's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the Dean of the House, Don Young, if he's still with us. I'm told he's next in line.
I am with you, Mr. Chairman.
There he is.
I'm with you all the time, as you know.
We were with each other yesterday.
I want to congratulate you on this hearing. I'm a co-chair with Mr. Bonamici from Oregon on the oceans. I'm very interested in the oceans. I've been interested in listening to the witnesses. I hope that we have learned to some degree that we don't allow any more dumping. I think we've stopped it to a great degree, but if it is occurring globally, that's something we have to understand. What's happening in an industrial country like China or other areas? Are they dumping? And that's because the oceans are all one. It's just one big meadow, and there's just cattle on one end and sheep on the other end, but it's one ocean, one pasture. So I'm very interested in the witnesses, and I would be interested in those barrels at 3,000 feet. What has happened? I think maybe, as the doctor said, maybe they're, or excuse me, I guess he's the secretary of the APA for California. But is it still what's there, and et cetera? Because if it is lethal, then it should be removed. But if it's not lethal, we may cause more problems by moving it. Sort of like asbestos. You know, asbestos is damaging if you start moving it, but if it's stabilized, it's not so damaging. A lot of times we've moved it and got more problems than otherwise. So I want to thank the witness. Thank you for having this hearing. The oceans are very dear to me. We got more ocean than the rest of you guys do all put together in Alaska. And I'm interested because the fisheries, I'm glad to hear the fact that contaminants do contaminate the fish, which we have to market. So we're trying to really watch this. So far, we've been very lucky. We did have some mercury for a while in the halibut, not other fish. That's been pretty much eradicated. And so again, thank you for having this hearing, and I'll listen for a little while longer, and we'll see what happens. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Well, I think, Congressman Young, did any of the witnesses want to comment on the question that was posed about whether leaving some of these things intact versus attempting to remove or remediate them might be the most appropriate strategy, or do we know enough? If Chairman Emeritus Young would allow me to pose his question as such.
This is Jared again. I think it's a great question from the Congressman, and exactly what we need to find out next, Chair Huffman, which is what is the shape of the barrels, how much is still in them, what's in them. Those are the primary questions we need to get to in order to make the kind of decisions about whether they're left in place or not. So spot exactly on point.
Good.
All right. So the gentleman has yielded. We'll go next to Congressman Mike Levin from Southern California. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Chairman, for putting this together today. And thank you to my fellow Californians, Alan and Grace and others that are deeply concerned about all of this. Dr. Alawahari, I wanted to thank you for participating today. I'm honored to have UCSD and Scripps in our district, right at the southern part of our district. Really is one of the crown jewels, I think, for this type of work in the world, and makes me extremely happy when I see incredibly smart people at the university take on the big issues of the day, such as this. A couple weeks ago, I met with Dr. Terrell from Scripps, and it was clear there's a lot left to be done, and that it won't be cheap to do it. Your written testimony does a really good job of laying out the remaining questions that need to be answered. And I think we all believe the federal government needs to have a prominent role in making sure that those questions are answered. A couple of my colleagues asked about budget, but I didn't hear anybody specifically ask you, Dr. Alawahari, about Scripps. And what federal resources you will need specifically to complete your work. And the more specific you could be, the better.
Thank you for that question. And of course, I'll also take the opportunity to provide a more detailed written response to that as well. But I think, so far in terms of a 3-year sort of reconnaissance phase, we've looked at budgets somewhere on the order of $6 to $10 million or so in terms of both in terms of using the technology like Dr. Terrell has used, but also in terms of setting up the ability to do the food web studies and, of course, the surveys on how the contaminants might be being mobilized, both by physical processes as well as biological processes.
Thank you very much for that, and we'll definitely look forward to getting any additional written backup for what you need. I want to turn to Secretary Blumenfeld, who I hope is still on. I think might have a connectivity issue. Secretary Blumenfeld, are you still there?
I am still here.
Fantastic. All right. Yeah, WebEx is not our friend this morning or this afternoon, but what are you going to do? Well, it's great to see you again. Thank you for all the great work that you're doing at Cal EPA, and in particular, all the work you're doing down in our neck of the woods, Tijuana River Valley and such. Look forward to continuing our work together. Wanted to ask, kind of thinking high level, what else do we need to be thinking about with regard to ocean dumping that was permitted at the time? And obviously what we see here in Southern California with this DDT issue, is this the tip of the iceberg, do you think, or is this the worst of what we're going to see?
Well, first of all, thank you for your leadership, and those Tijuana River issues just show how much is really happening today that impacts our communities, and these issues, we like to think of them in our rear view mirror as like happening in the 40s through the 60s, but there's still a lot happening today. And just to mark, as the chair did at the beginning, World Oceans Day, about 10 million tons of plastic end up in the ocean every single year, according to UC Santa Barbara. So, yeah, I wish that it was the worst that we're going to see, but I unfortunately believe that it is the tip of the iceberg. We have institutions like Scripps and others, and a lot of advocacy and kind of historical record. Others, other places in the world, to Congressman Young's point, just dump stuff and probably continue to dump stuff without any record of it. So the oceans are not in great shape. We all know that. This is one area that we can really, I think, bring attention to how we think about the oceans, and not just places that we dump stuff. But I would anticipate the more we look, the more we will find.
Well, I appreciate that. And Dr. Alohari, if there's time, I have one last question for you. I saw you were a biogeochemist, and I guess what can you tell us based on your research about the hydrological processes of the region, and specifically the likelihood that DDT could infiltrate the food web or the waters closer to human interaction?
Thank you for that question, Congressman Levin. Yeah, so, the coastal California is known for its upwelling. That's what makes the coast productive. You've got deep waters that come up to the surface, rich in nutrients that sustain these very productive food webs that we're all glad are in our coastal waters. However, that upwelling usually comes from the depths of about 200 to 300 meters at most. And so it's unlikely that just that physical movement of water would transport sediments to the surface. However, what we do know is that even though these bottom waters are low in oxygen and likely to increase, that decrease in oxygen is likely to continue as the surface oceans warm. There are organisms in that environment, microbes, as well as burrowing organisms. And that, I think, is a potentially really important pathway for us to assess in terms of how that then gets incorporated into the food web at the surface. So, lots of people look at the gut contents of dolphins, and Dr. Ho can talk about this more, to try to understand what is the diet that these organisms are eating. And I think there's still some discussion about sort of the depths from which these organisms are deriving their food. These particles, there are also bottom currents that are actually quite important that can remobilize the sediments. And we know the sediments contain DDT. There's data on that, as well as other contaminants like petroleum waste. And so if those get resuspended, those can easily get ingested by organisms and then transferred up the food web. And so those are the pathways I think that we're really focusing on with respect to how this material might enter the food web that actually is relevant for human consumption.
Thank you, Doctor. And I thank the gentleman. We'll now go to Congressman Alan Lowenthal from Long Beach. Thank you for pinch hitting for me when my network was down, Dr. Lowenthal, and you're making me feel better about my connectivity, because on my screen you've been kind of flickering in and out like one of those old neon signs where a couple of the letters kind of come and go. But you've been a beacon
of my life.
on this issue.
This flickering is who I am. And as a one flickerer to another flickerer, it's a pleasure to be here. And we're really here because, as we've already pointed out, that the widely accepted approach to how we dealt with pollution was the overly simplistic, that the solution to pollution was dilution. That was it. That was the solution. We now know that this simplistic approach is in actuality just pushes the pollution and the problems to a different community or to a different generation. We are now living with that because we now have the technology to see the impact. We did not know how many barrels. I recall now that we're talking about a lot of it that was spread out, that was not dumped where it was supposed to be dumped. There are a lot of issues around this and how we did this, that there are over 27,000 barrels that are out there that to some extent have contaminants or DDT, to some extent may have their parts of it or what was in the barrels may already have been released. We have no idea at this moment. So there's much that we don't know. But in the case of these 27,000 or tens of thousands, let's just say, of dumped DDT barrels off the island of Catalina, because that's what we're talking about, not just those that were done through pipelines off the Palos Verdes coast, which was the interstate waters, but we're talking about now the tens of thousands of dumped barrels off the island of Catalina, which is in my district. We see this shameful legacy of industrial pollution, which potentially has impacts our ocean, our environment, our wildlife, our public health. And these are the generations now. I don't know what Catalina does. Come to Catalina to see pollution, go fishing off the coast of Catalina for pollution. So it really, I have some very specific questions. Mr. Palmer, as you mentioned in your excellent testimony, the Superfund site provided resources and remediation for pollution that was carried through a pipeline to the immediate nearshore area of Palos Verdes, but did almost nothing to address the impact or aid to the people in offshore dumping areas like your home in Catalina. Do you see a potential for a new settlement or Superfund site designation? And could you objectively share where those resources should be directed and how should they be used? Because we're just coming to grips with the enormity of this and the potential crisis to the island of Catalina.
Thank you, Congressman Lowenthal. I really appreciate the comments, and I don't know if I'm the most appropriate to dictate where resources are going, but I will say, as a local government as well as a municipality on an island that's privately managed, we have a very strong environmental sense of philosophy, rather, and we've worked really hard to maintain that protected status in our marine as well as our land areas. I'm definitely troubled and very concerned about the primary method in which DDT is entering in, which is through the food pathway to contamination and the ripple effect that has, not just in the coastal waters surrounding California, but also how it impacts ecological systems on the land as well. As you may know, we've had issues in the past with breeding of bald eagles here. There's been a lot of shell issues and whatnot, and I would love to see resources go to continue to make sure that those land-based ecosystems as well as marine-based ecosystems continue to stay protected and stay pristine, and that we've got the ability to enjoy it from a recreational as well as a conservation standpoint.
Thank you, Mr. Palmer. My next question is for Dr. Again, I hope I pronounce it, Aluwihara. In your testimony, you mentioned that DDT compounds is the most prevalent human-made chemical found in California marine mammals. Based upon your extensive involvement and research in the region, do you feel we're doing enough consistent testing for all potential harmful human-made contaminants, or are there additional chemicals we should begin to be monitoring now as well? Where are we in the process of monitoring and really understanding what are the pollutants potentially in the region?
Thank you for that question, Congressman Lowenthal, and your leadership on this issue. I do feel that Dr. Ho from SDSU is better poised to answer the question of the contaminant distributions and potentially, yeah, thank you.
Let's go to Dr. Ho.
Okay. Yes. So my past experience of the research in the region, especially the ocean pollution contaminants monitoring, is quite limited. So it was a lucky till we were able to do the DDT and other chemical contaminants screening by using the marine mammals. However, those are very, very limited. Although the limited research provided us large suite of chemical contaminants are existing in the Southern California bight. So we need more resources, we need more funding to screen and more proactive screening of contaminants in the ocean, which previous witness mentioned about other chemicals that we know, like plastics and PFAS, all kind of new chemical contaminants. But always is so surprising is all these legacy contaminants are extremely abundant in Southern California. The problem is that we are missing, didn't focus on those chemicals are degrade. And then there are other impurity chemicals existing there. So there's
Dr. Ho, I'm going to have to keep us moving. I apologize.
Sure.
But the time has expired, and the chair now recognizes Steve Cohen. We're delighted to have a Highlander from Memphis join us on this ocean dumping hearing. Mr. Cohen, you're recognized for 5 minutes. You're muted, though. There you go.
Mr. Chair, I'm not sure what you mean by a Highlander.
Uplander, non-coastal member, but all-around good guy.
Thank you. I did go to school in Pasadena, and when I did, one of my teachers at Pasadena Poly was all on the Condor, and the Condor was doing things with DDT back then, and the Condor is still around, and the poor picked on Condor. But what I've gotten out of this committee is hearing, and I appreciate your having it, is that we as a species have used the ocean as a dumping ground and a garbage pool, and we need to stop it. Alan Lowenthal has well pointed out in many bills what we've done with plastics and putting them in the ocean. And now we have DDT, and we're going to have many, many, many more times we're going to find things. We've also used the air as a dumping ground and a garbage container. And it has been disaster to our environment, to our health, and will continue to for generations to come. And so we need to have a Green New Deal, and we need to fight climate change, and we need to wake up and reorient ourselves to the next generation and what's left of ours to enjoy the air and the water, the condors and the beaches, and Catalina, which you can see, as I understand it, on Fair Day. So, there's a lot we need to do. For my Republican colleagues, the White House shouldn't be a dumping ground or a garbage can either. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Representative Cohen. I believe the last person I have on the list is Congressman Darren Soto from Florida. So welcome, the gentleman from Florida. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Chairman. Whether it is DDT dumping in Southern California or it's wastewater dumping in Florida, this is continuously a challenge and one that we applaud you for bringing forward. It was 2008 when you had all three of the major counties in South Florida continue to dump at least 300 million gallons of partially treated urban wastewater too polluted even for watering lawns. The dumping took place in a heavily tourist-dependent area, and the practice dated back to the 1940s, much like the legacy of what we're here to discuss today. And it wreaked havoc on our oceans, on our reefs. One of the reasons why we're working on the Resilient Reefs Act in your area, in this committee, the intensive red tides that it created. And it was a colleague of ours, then Governor Charlie Crist, and a younger state legislator in 2008, me, along with many others, that passed a bill that set them on the track for 2025 to close all these. And I believe all but 3 of them are now closed. And these types of partnerships are key for protecting our reefs. Today, we're here to make sure that California and Southern California, that we address these key issues. So my first question is for Secretary Jared Blumenfield, California Secretary for Environmental Protection. Secretary Blumenfield, considering your experience working with local parks, recreation, and redevelopment authorities, what concerns do you have about the potential impact of legacy dump sites like the one recently documented in Southern California Bight on the local recreation and tourism areas close to ocean dumping contamination?
Thank you, Congressman Soto, for the question and for your leadership on these issues. And as I think we heard from the manager, Palmer, until we have certainty, there are perception issues about fishing, about going to recreation areas because of that uncertainty. So the more we can ascertain what exactly is going on, the more confidence we can give the public. But at the moment, I think part of the benefit of this hearing today is to give recreators in Southern California and other places a knowledge of the status of where we're at. But at the moment, when I talk to people, there is concern until there's more clarity.
So it definitely would have a negative effect, is what I'm hearing. And Dr. Alowihari, in your testimony, you mentioned the depth of the Southern California Bight dump site is unique in terms of industrial chemical pollution sites. Should we raise similar concern for the more shallow legacy chemical dump sites in the Gulf of Mexico, Atlantic and Pacific, or such practices as drilling or dredging or natural disturbances such as increasingly intense hurricanes may occur?
Thank you for that question, Congressman Soto. Certainly, I think trying to get a sense of what the risks are in all of these different areas is paramount. I think the focus today is on the dump sites in the California borderlands because of the recent data coming out of both Scripps and the attention that was drawn to it by the Los Angeles Times piece. But certainly there are opportunities to conduct this kind of work in other regions as well, to get the knowledge that we know in order to move forward.
Thank you, Doctor. And Chairman Huffman, as you know, we're working on the American Jobs Plan to Build Back Better. And as we're looking at removing the pollution legacies of the 20th century through capping oil wells, through fixing old coal mines, and working on stopping the gypsum stacks in my state, this is another key area where we can build back better. We can address pollution to save the next generation and create jobs in the meantime. So I'm very excited that our committee is working on these pollution mitigation issues, and I yield back.
Well said. I thank the gentleman very much. And I want to also thank the witnesses for their incredibly valuable testimony and all the members who engaged so thoughtfully. I feel like we've just scratched the surface, really, of this subject, and there's a lot more we need to know, but this was an important first step. Let me also thank our subcommittee staff who really put a lot of work into pulling this hearing together, and you can really see that from their very comprehensive background memo on this hearing, which is one of the better ones that I have seen. So members of the committee may have some additional questions for the witnesses. We'll ask the witnesses to respond to those in writing. Under Committee Rule 3.0, members of the committee must submit those questions within 3 business days following the hearing, and the hearing record will be open for 10 days thereafter to allow for responses. If there is no further business before the committee, then without objection, we stand adjourned. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.